Not good. Whole thing's going. Time to take cover. Time to take cover. Look at this.
Somewhere, just over the horizon, a storm is brewing. During the last 4 decades, we have seen more major hurricanes.
Please pray for us.
Bigger, stronger, and more devastating.
This has been really bad.
What's causing them? And what do you need to do to protect your family? The severe weather experts are here to answer your questions.
The force of the wind, the power of the water. The pictures are becoming familiar to us all. Hurricanes, one of the most destructive natural forces on the planet. In 2020, they were responsible for more than $50 billion, with a B, $50 billion in damage. Hello, I'm Chief Meteorologist James Spann. As we move through the 2021 hurricane season, we want to take a moment and have a conversation about hurricanes. I need you to listen up. The discussion we're about to have here involves the safety and the security of your family. The Sinclair Broadcast Group has meteorologists stationed along the United States coastlines impacted by Atlantic Basin hurricanes. From the southern tip of Texas to Canada and Maine, we have you covered. We have brought several of those together today for our conversation. They are the severe weather experts. We will discuss the above average hurricane period we are in and what you can do to be prepared. In Austin, Texas, we have KEYE-TV Chief Meteorologist Chicago Windler. In Mobile, on the Gulf Coast, we have WPMI Chief Meteorologist Alan Seals. In West Palm Beach, Florida, we have Chief Meteorologist VYTAS REID. And in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, we have Chief Meteorologist Ed Piotrowski. Before we discuss 2021, we need to discuss 2020. This was the 5th consecutive above-average season on record. During the season, we had 30 named storms, 14 hurricanes, 7 major hurricanes, $51 billion in damage, and 416 deaths. So looking ahead to 2021, the first question for my colleagues, are we setting up to have a 6th above average season? Alan Seals in Mobile, let's start with you. Your thoughts on this season?
My season, obviously, it started very fast, but I always remind people how you start the race doesn't define how you end the race. And to that end, it's one storm. It always comes back to one storm. Just the other day, someone asked me, is there going to be a bad storm this year? And I said, yes, but I don't know where, I don't know when. And if it's the storm that hits your house, that's going to be a bad storm. Honestly, though, with regard to the long-term outlooks, my job here on the Gulf Coast is to take it day by day, week by week. So I kind of look at the long-term outlooks, but I'm more concerned about what I see today and what the data shows that may occur within the next week.
Let's go to the Atlantic coast. Ed, your thoughts on the upcoming season?
I could not agree with Alan more. Whether we have 5 named storms or 25 named storms, it only takes one hitting your community to make it a really bad season. So every single year, regardless of what those forecasts are telling you, it's always important to be prepared. You look at 1992, we only had 7 named storms that year, and that was the year Hurricane Andrew slammed into South Florida, a Category 5 hurricane. And then there are seasons where you have 19, 20 named storms and you don't get hit at all. So you have to prepare every single year because, as Alan said, we don't know where those storms are going to go until they actually form. So none of those forecasts that are put out there by Dr. Phil Klotzbach or NOAA actually say where those storms are going to go. That's our job to figure that out 5 to 7 days out.
Chicago, what do you think about the season coming from your perspective in Texas?
Well, I think that last year, Louisiana had 5 storms make landfall, and storms to the east of us generally don't bring big impacts to the west on the hot, dry side. So here in Texas, I think because we didn't have a bad season last year in Texas proper, some people have let their guard down. And a lot of people are moving in from out of state, especially from California, who have never dealt with hurricanes, tropical storms, or any type of weather like that before. So my concerns are we could have an above average season, but a lot of people here don't even know what a hurricane can do. So we just need to prepare them all.
And VYTAS, obviously in West Palm Beach, folks there do know what hurricanes can do. What are your thoughts on the season?
My concern is when we talk about numbers, of course, like Alan and all of you said, these numbers have fluctuations, and it only takes one. It only takes one that makes the difference, that affects your life and your family. And it could be that one with this increasing climate change that might have more impact and more effect with heavier rain or much more flooding, much more storm surge and those kind of things in the coast. So we have to watch that very closely, especially with more people living along the coast. It is something that is quite challenging for us as meteorologists to try to get people to understand, but yet have action, a plan of action for either evacuation or just riding out a storm if they plan on sticking around.
And I'll say the one thing I think we've all learned, all of us here, our background is physical science. That's what we do. Our background is not necessarily social science, and we're asking people to do something, to evacuate, to take precautions. And we're integrating social science into physical science, this interdisciplinary approach. And I think we've learned a lot from the social scientists in terms of getting people to listen. But this year, we are off to already an early start. We had Tropical Storm Claudette that made landfall in Louisiana on June the 19th, just a tropical storm, but the damage was very significant in my state. We saw tornadoes, we saw flooding, and the storm was responsible for 14 fatalities. And that itself raises some questions. So let's start with the man that tracked that storm as it came ashore, Alan Seals. Alan, people say, it's just a tropical storm. It's no big deal. Yet 14 people lost their life. We had $1 million in damage. Kind of talk about Claudette. What can we learn from that storm?
Claudette was unique because, again, the watches and warnings were issued before landfall. That's the whole purpose of calling something a potential tropical cyclone. After landfall, it picked up the structure of a tropical storm. The wind speed didn't really change, and that's when it was technically called Tropical Storm Claudette. People say just a tropical storm, but there's no such thing as just a tropical storm. Each one is so unique, and for Claudette, in my area, the immediate impact, 2 tornadoes, one an EF0 that stayed on the ground for just 100 yards, injured 1 person. The other one was an EF2 tornado in our inland counties that injured dozens of people. That was in the community of Brewing. So those are some of the threats of a tropical storm. A lot of people perceive it to be one thing, but it could be surge, rain, tornadoes, and of course, wind.
And I think that's the important point, Alan, is that a lot of the impact is not necessarily directly on the coast. Sure, that's where the storm surge will be. But this horrible traffic accident responsible for almost 10 fatalities, that was well inland near Greenville, Alabama, which is about 100 miles inland. And that was the result of extremely heavy rain that was falling at the time. And the tornadoes occurred were inland, the tornado at Brewing. So understand people inland also have to pay attention. A lot of folks say, well, I'm not on the Gulf Coast. What is this to me? And in Chicago, you kind of deal with that in Austin. You're not on the coast, but you have big impacts from tropical systems there.
We have tremendous impacts. And one of the best examples of the impact of an inland surge of moisture would be Harvey. Hurricane Harvey makes landfall down on the South Texas coast, then weakens to a tropical storm. We all know Hurricane Harvey because of 60 inches of rain setting records in Texas and parts of Louisiana. But the majority of that rain didn't fall while Harvey was a hurricane. It fell while Harvey was a tropical storm. Inland, all the way to Austin, we had winds gusting to 50 miles per hour. My fence in my backyard was blown down because of Harvey, this far inland.
Yeah, let's talk about a trend that we have seen in recent years. Storms that rapidly intensify, hurricanes that rapidly intensify right before a landfall. If you would talk a little bit about that trend and the concerns you have as a meteorologist on the Atlantic coast.
Honestly, it's my biggest fear is that we go to bed with a tropical storm and we wake up the next morning with a Category 1 or 2 hurricane and people have not taken the necessary precautions. We all know that people, for the most part, are going to move away from the coast when you have a Category 3, 4, or 5, but it's getting people to move away from the coast when you have a Category 1 or 2. And if they're rapidly intensifying because of extraordinarily warm water, that's going to be an issue for evacuation because a lot of people like to stay right near the coast. And we've noticed that with climate change, not only is the water warming, it's also expanding. So outside of the main tropics, we also have the subtropics, if you will, that are warming up as well. And some of these tropical systems are actually gaining their peak intensity outside of the tropics. So places that are not used to hurricanes, rapid intensification is our biggest fear. And it's also the one thing that we have the least amount of study being done on. In other words, in terms of it actually increasing intensity, what kind of information are we getting from the National Hurricane Center and others that are helping to aid us in determining if something is going to rapidly intensify over time? And that's where studying continues, and hopefully we'll have a better understanding as time goes along so people will be aware of that possibility.
VYTAS, let's talk about the Saffir-Simpson scale. It's been around for a long time. It's how we rank hurricane intensity. Is that a metric that needs to change? Do we need to keep it? Do we need to change the Saffir-Simpson scale? Your thoughts on that? And that sometimes you hear a Category 1 and you think, well, that's not that bad. But yet Category 1 hurricanes are extremely dangerous. Your thoughts on that scale, and what do we need to do about it, if anything?
Yeah, I could see it going away, to be honest. I think that we can just talk about how strong a storm is. And because we could see something so dangerous as a Category 1 or a tropical storm do more damage, for instance, like Superstorm Sandy, as a tropical storm, once a hurricane, but came in on shore, affecting New Jersey and all of those areas up around New York and Long Island, causing substantial damage. And we see that affect millions and millions of people because it's such vast. So we're talking about even greater and larger storms. So we have these categories that kind of place these storms in based on wind, but yet a lot of the damage is more so from flooding and storm surge and how much water is brought in from these types of storms. And I think as we progress in our meteorology studies of understanding these storms, it'll be more on the threat level of how many people live in an area, a populated area versus a non-populated area, and what is the potential of that storm versus the wind versus the rain and the flooding versus the categories, that's per se. So I think that we have to get in a mindset of just understanding that because it's a Category 5 versus a Cat 1 or a tropical storm, that tropical storm could be just as deadly or even more so than the Category 5 based on your population and where it's making landfall.
Next, the 3 lessons learned from a season of superstorms.
I want to go down to Alan. Alan, let's talk about Hurricane Sally from last year. There was some rumbling from folks on the Gulf Coast that they weren't prepared for a storm of that intensity. Is the Saffir-Simpson scale coming into play with that? And to talk about the Sally experience and what can people learn from that?
Boy, there were so many lessons that came out of Sally, including one that I just picked up a couple of days ago, which I'll share in a moment. Sally was moving at landfall. It was moving at about 5 times slower than the typical hurricane. And yes, people were focusing on that category. Is it a 1? Is it a 2? Can it go to a 3? What I find is people, whether it's within our industry, and I'm not talking about meteorologists or the general public, they focus so much on that category. And I remind them the difference between categories is 1 mile per hour. It's a large latitude within that category. So Sally came in as a high Category 2. The fact that it slowed put it on our coastline far longer than most Category 2 storms. So the damage, most people said it wasn't a Category 2. They should upgrade it. That's trivial when you just look at the damage. And the damage was from what people would have expected to be a stronger storm. But it was because it was a slow-moving storm that it did so much damage. And to this day, people are still recovering from Sally.
And I totally agree. No 2 Category 2 hurricanes are alike. No 2 Category 3 hurricanes are alike. They all are different in terms of forward speed, size, the wind radius. And that's a great point, Alan. Chicago, you were close by to Hurricane Laura that came up into Louisiana. What a storm last year. What lessons can we learn from that one?
Well, I think that the lessons learned are that there can be multiple storms that strike the same state. We had 5 landfalls, 2 tropical storms, 3 hurricanes in the state of Louisiana last season. Laura was the strongest, came ashore, Cameron, Louisiana, 150 mile per hour winds. That's a Category 4. As it moved inland, the community of Lake Charles, Louisiana, absolutely devastated. There were some waterways just to the east of the track, and all of that water went to all of the wrong places. People still recovering. There were power outages that lasted weeks, if not months, in some locations as well. And folks in Louisiana, they know hurricanes. They've seen hurricanes, so they were not necessarily unprepared, but Laura was one of those instances where they had never seen a storm of that magnitude since 1856. Last island hurricane, also with 150 mile per hour winds, obviously before any of our lifetimes. And I believe there are still people to this day who have not totally rebuilt or recovered from what Laura did to the state of Louisiana. And to that end, Had Laura pushed a little farther to the west and moved into Texas, those same catastrophic impacts could have affected parts of my state as well. So that's one of the things I always like to share with people is it could have been us, and we need to be prepared for if that could have been us.
Let's go to Ed. Ed, one thing we all learned in the weather world was how to pronounce Isaias last year. You dealt directly with that Category 1 hurricane that produced almost $5 billion in damage. What lessons can we learn from that storm?
Whole lot of lessons from that storm. It was a strengthening storm as it was approaching the Carolina coast. Winds were at 85 miles per hour at landfall. And so many people in the Carolinas are very hurricane weary from all the rainfall. Hurricane Matthew in 2016, Hurricane Florence in 2018 produced catastrophic flooding in our area. And 75% of the people who died in the Carolinas was from freshwater flooding. So they kind of understand about the flooding. A lot of people along the coast, though, don't necessarily take the storm surge threat seriously. And the storm surge ended up being 3 to 6 feet from roughly North Myrtle Beach all the way along the south coast of North Carolina, devastating homes. There were several hundred cars that were damaged or destroyed by the storm surge. And of course, we had many homes that were damaged and even destroyed by that large storm surge as well. So it's so important to remember that there are multiple impacts from any landfalling hurricane. It's not just the wind. It's not just the rain. It's not just the tornadoes. It's also the storm surge.
And, of course, we did have some really big hurricanes last year. VYTAS, you are in Florida.
So definitely the storm surge and the flooding is a major part of this, like Ed was mentioning. It takes me back, if I could hop up to Baltimore before I came to Florida, back to Isabel back in 2003. I had just pretty much moved to Baltimore, and I experienced that storm. It was a hurricane, but became a tropical storm. But being on the Chesapeake Bay, it drug in a lot of storm surge. We saw flooding in the inner harbor there. It was forecasted about 8-foot storm surge, but we got about 12 foot. So all of that inner harbor and downtown was flooded. And part of it, while the sun was out, 2 to 3 days later was a slosh factor on top of what was forecasted, more pull. That storm was sitting up in upstate New York and still had an effect of pulling water into the Chesapeake Bay. And it's basically a canal. It seemed like that it was just bringing in water. So it's one of those things that days after you can still have effects from these major storms meteorologically across the area. So that's something we have to be very aware of. And the concern is, will people listen and adhere to what your warnings are? And these storms can be very unpredictable at times.
Next, the one thing you need to know to be prepared this hurricane season.
Let's get practical here. Social media can be a cesspool of horrible information when it comes to severe weather. And a lot of people are accessing weather now via Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram. Alan Seals, what advice do you have for people that are looking for good information involving tropical systems?
Watch us. That's my advice. That's the first advice. Don't trust social media feeds and shares that you don't know where they came from or what it means or has no context of what it is. Social media is great for finding out what happened at different people's homes, what sort of damage happened in different communities. But without fail, after every storm, we all hear two comments. One was, you guys didn't say it was going to be that bad. And the other comment is, it wasn't that bad as you guys said. And that goes into the structures of tropical storms and hurricanes, where they are banded storms, not one solid area. So for me, social media, the good aspect is educating people before things happen as to what it exactly is and what it means.
Ed, when it comes to getting ready for the hurricane season, what's the one screaming message that you'd like to communicate in terms of preparedness?
Bottom line, stay vigilant. The peak of hurricane season is roughly from August 20th through October 10th. That's when 75% of all the Category 3 or major hurricanes actually occur. And it's important to remember, as Alan said earlier, things can change, and they can change very, very rapidly. Think about the 4 Category 5 hurricanes that have actually hit the United States. Camille in 69, Michael in 2018, the Florida Keys hurricane of 35, and of course Andrew in 92. All 4 of those Category 5s at landfall 3 days prior were just tropical storms. So if you decided to turn the TV off 3 days before this system actually began to develop, you would have missed it completely. So stay vigilant and make sure you're watching each and every day to get updated and see what kind of changes, for better or worse, could be coming your way.
And Chicago, your advice for people that are watching us in terms of getting ready for the hurricane season, something that they need to hear.
So a couple of important things are, we live by these, right? All of our TV stations have weather apps that you can search our TV stations and download those weather apps so that you can actually track the storms. You can also get forecasts. You can stream live weathercasts from each of our stations. That's a great recommendation. And you also should be prepared for possibly losing power. So it might not be a bad idea to invest in a charging block and some other technology so that if you do lose power, you have a way to stay plugged in and stay connected.
And VYTAS, from you, a lot of folks perhaps are moving to Florida for the first time. This is their first hurricane season. This can be bewildering to somebody that comes from North Dakota or Michigan. Your thoughts for maybe some of the newcomers that are having to deal with this?
People have to educate themselves about their area. It's not just you move to somewhere and I learn where the restaurants are. I know where the grocery store is. I live in a hurricane zone. So I need to know what my evacuation route is. I need to know what my preparation time is, where the evacuation routes are, know your evacuation routes, and know what is involved in living in Florida.
And I think you made a great point. It's important to be able to find your house on a map. We've learned through social science studies that many people don't have adequate map skills, and that's simply because smartphones give turn-by-turn directions. You don't necessarily have to have them now, but during severe weather, a hurricane, a tropical storm, a tornado, you need to be able to find your house on a map. We have to use maps to communicate risk and danger. That's important. And the other thing, too, is just don't be too afraid of hurricanes and tropical storms. They always happen, but if you're informed, you don't have to have that fear level. And one more thing, I do want to encourage people to focus on local meteorologists. There's some wonderful national organizations that do weather, but you cannot effectively communicate weather threats and weather risk unless you understand the people, the culture, and the geography of the market that you serve. And for all of my colleagues that have been gathered together for this program, they are those people. They understand the market. They understand what needs to be communicated. They understand what's happened in the past. And I would encourage you to find my colleagues. Sinclair has wonderful television operations all up and down the coasts of the United States, to find your local meteorologist and stick with them as a good source. Are we perfect? No. We'll always make forecast mistakes, but at the same time, most of us have been around for a long time, and we do our best to keep you informed. So thank you so much for taking the time to watch this program. Be prepared, not scared. We'll get through this hurricane season just fine.